On today's episode, we are talking about storytelling, which is incredibly important. It's something that we talk about all the time as a really important skill to have when you're a guest on podcasts. So I'm really excited to have Gabrielle Dolan on the podcast, who's an incredible interview connections client. This is her expertise. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. So it was while working in senior leadership roles in corporate Australia that she realized the power of storytelling in effective business communication. And she's now a highly sought after international keynote speaker and educator. And her impressive client list includes Visa, EY, Amazon, Vodafone, and the Obama Foundation. I'm sorry. She got to meet Barack Obama while undertaking that work. Let's just take a moment to take that in. I think you all now know my politics, but very cool. Welcome to the show.
I know. And that work for the Obama Foundation was absolute highlight of my career. And meeting him was a little added special bonus right at the end of the training.
Oh my goodness. So wait, just okay, let's start there.
Share the story
of how meeting Barack Obama.
Yeah. So I got an email from the Obama Foundation asking me, would I be interested in having a meeting to talk about running training as part of their leadership program. And when you get an email from that, you sort of go, someone is trying to pull my leg.
Yeah, right. You're
anyway,
like, is this real?
Is this real? And so I responded straight away. We set up a meeting. Anyway, I went, the Obama Foundation run a program. They run them around the world. This one was for the Asia Pacific region. They had 200 young leaders from around the world coming to Malaysia for a 5-day event. Michelle Obama was there as well, and Barack Obama. It was the first time they'd sort of come to a conference. I ran the training throughout the week on storytelling. Barack Obama was there the last day to do a keynote, and we were told there is no way known we will meet him. And in fact, we thought he'd already left the building, and all the 200 participants went inside for an official photograph. And me as one of the speakers and a few other speakers were sitting just outside waiting for them to come out. And then he walks past with his entourage of security guards and goes in for the official photo. And we're sort of going, oh my goodness. And anyway, all the security guards come over and remind us again that you can't approach him, that you can't take photos of him. And it was like, okay. But when he came out, he saw that we were the speakers, and he broke ranks, and he came over and he introduced himself and he spoke to us. And then he said, let's get a photo with the speakers. I actually had my 19-year-old daughter with me at the time because she studies global politics. And so there's a photo of me and him and her and a couple of other speakers. It's so good.
That's so amazing. I remember when he was first running for president, we saw him speak at Rhode Island College, and then Margie and I actually saw Michelle Obama speak at Inbound in Boston back in I think it was 2017, and it was like the energy in the room when she came out. We were just like, oh my God. This is so amazing. So I can't imagine meeting them face to face. It's so cool.
Yeah. I was actually surprised how when he left, it took me about half an hour to sort of calm down. And I'm thinking I wasn't a big mad fan or anything.
Right.
I truly respect him as a leader, but I was like, oh my God, the effect it has on people is amazing.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, I promise listeners, we're not just going to gab about Obama the whole time, but I mean, such a great way to start off the episode, sharing a story, because that's your expertise. So can you share how, I'm just going to ask you kind of the most obvious question. What are the components of an effective story?
Yeah, so that's actually probably a good question to start with. And what I find is one of the biggest mistakes people make when they're talking about storytelling is that they don't share a story. They think it's a story, or they call it a story, but it's a timeline of events. So there's a couple of things that make a really effective story. First of all, let's go to real basics. It's got to have a beginning, middle, and end. So you don't want to be that person telling a story without an end. I always say that the never-ending story even had an ending. So you've got to be beginning, middle, and end. In business, it's got to be really succinct. So to me, it's got to be really succinct. You don't want to be sharing a story that takes 5 or 10 minutes. So to me, it's about 1 or 2 minutes in. That's how long it should be. And if people want to find out more information, they should. And you sort of got to go specific. So when you go specific, what it does, it helps people visualize something, and it helps people, and it helps people feel something. And ultimately, that's what a story does. It taps into emotion.
Perfect. So, what are so you said some of the biggest mistakes people make is there's no ending and there's a timeline. And it's interesting because I just did a webinar actually for our community. And one of the things I shared was that, telling stories in your interviews is a way that you can really show up powerfully, because what's the old saying, like facts tell, stories sell.
Yep.
And I actually brought up some people like onto the stage with me and just had them practice and like share a story. And I did hear that. I heard a timeline. Like first I was doing this and that this type of person, but it wasn't really like dropping people into a moment. And that's something that I've learned from another speaking coach. Can you talk about that, of like, how do you really start a story in a way that has people feel really engaged?
Yeah. So the worst way to start a story is to say, "Let me tell you a story." So,
Okay, that's good.
When people sort of go, "Let me tell you a story," and you sort of go, "Oh, please don't." It's like, just tell me the point. Um, and it's ironic because as humans, we're actually hardwired to tell stories, and we're hardwired to listen to stories. But often in a business setting, if people go, "Oh, let me tell you a story," it's like, oh, you just sort of think it's going to take forever. The most effective way to start a story is with time and place. So there's an infinite amount of variations to time and place. It could be like, when I was a kid, I grew up on a farm, or when I was in my 20s, I went on an African safari, or this morning at gym. It signals to your audience that you're about to tell them a story, and that because we're hardwired to listen to stories, they're listening to you now differently. So it's sort of, and especially in a professional setting where it can be a little bit blah, 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 and facts and timelines, if someone sort of then goes, "Oh, that actually reminds me when I went camping with 8 of my friends," and it's like a pattern interrupt. It sort of interrupts what you're saying, and people are really listening to you. So time and place is how you start a story.
Okay, perfect. And I want to jump, like, how do you end the story? Because I think
Yeah.
people kind of want to just keep talking about it.
Yeah, look, the ending is the hardest part. So, where the start is relatively simple, one sentence, get into it. When I was a kid, I grew up on a farm type thing. The ending is the hardest part because you don't want to be ending your story with the moral of the story is.
Let me tell
There's
you why I told you that story.
Yeah, let me tell you why I told you that story and what you should get out of it. You could end your story with what I learned from that. So you talk about storytelling for in job interviews. A really good way to end a story in a job interview is, and you don't want all of them, but what I learned from that was this. What I was really proud we were able to achieve was this. So that's a really good way to end your story in a job interview setting, for example, or any other one. But what you want to do, especially if it's a personal story, you need to link it back to the business message, but not be directive. So it's quite complicated, but it's sort of things like, the reason I'm sharing this with you is because it reminds me of what we're going through now at work, and imagine what we could achieve if we all, and then sort of link it to what your story was about. But you don't want to be going on and on and on about the ending, because that's the biggest mistake people make. They sort of end and then think, "Oh, maybe they didn't get it." So they keep reiterating the point again. And in the end, people are going, "I got it. Will you stop talking?"
Yeah, I love that. That's something else that I talk about, is like the golden silence, right? Being confident enough to have that pause so people can
Yeah.
actually take it in. And,
Yeah, Jess. And the pause is so once you've finished a story, always pause. Just stop talking for 1 or 2 seconds, because that's the real power of the story, where they are taking it in. And we get we don't like pauses, so we keep talking.
yeah. And I think, after the story of you meeting Barack Obama, you ended it. Obviously, you did it perfectly. You paused, and it left me wanting more. And I'm like, well, I kind of want to ask you more about it, rather than you rambling on. And maybe like, if somebody rambles on, they don't pause. You could be getting into stuff that they don't care about.
Exactly, exactly. It's like a good cliffhanger ending in any good Netflix series. Want them coming back for more, not giving them everything.
Yeah. Why do you think it's hard for people to pause?
It's a good question. I just think we get really uncomfortable with the pause. Sometimes when you've even, say you've forgotten what you're going to say and you pause and it's only for a second, but it feels like it's forever. I think sometimes at the end of the story, when people pause, they sit there and go, why is everyone quiet? Maybe they didn't get it. But when you got to understand they're actually processing it. So,
Mhm.
look, and there's a lot of people that just like the sound of their own voice and that will never pause at any time.
Yeah, so true. So our listeners of this podcast are, you know, getting interviewed on podcasts, they are getting visibility. The title of the show is Monetize the Mic. So I want to really focus on storytelling in the podcast interview space. So can you walk our listeners through? I mean, we talked about how stories need to have a beginning, middle, and end. You need to end with a pause, and I'll just keep talking. What other tips do you have for the podcast guests that they've just kind of created their topics and questions? They're getting interviewed, and now they're like, I need to create stories. Like, where do they even start? How do you start building up this like arsenal of stories that you share?
Yeah. So where you start, you actually don't start with the stories at all. You start with the messages you want to communicate. So what is it you want to communicate? Now, we're talking specifically about a podcast. So what are you trying to communicate over the podcast? But that could be whether you're doing an interview, just a normal interview or a presentation. Be really, really clear on what are the messages you want to communicate. So then once you're clear on the messages, you should be saying, what are the stories I can share? And I think you should think of two different types of stories. One are your own personal stories. So perhaps it's in a podcast, why are you passionate about what you're doing? And in most cases, that's starting from, a personal value you have. So think of the personal stories you can share and then think of I guess the work related stories that you've done. So it's those two, because the personal stories are the ones that are more interesting. So it's just going, be clear on the message, know what it is you want to get across, and then constantly ask yourself, what story could I share? We've sort of talked, Jess, you sort of talk, why are people reluctant even to do this? It's because sometimes they just think, oh, my stories aren't interesting enough and no one would be interested. But they are, because it creates a human connection.
Yeah. So how is it just that everyone's stories are interesting, or how do you know when a story is interesting and relevant or not?
Yeah, look, I think most people's stories are interesting. And when I say most people's stories, I'm not talking about, your life story. And I think
Yeah.
that's another, people think, what is your life story? But, I think if any person doing a podcast, for example, is clearly passionate about what they're doing, they clearly know what they're doing. I could almost guarantee you that started from somewhere. Like, where did that start? And whatever subject they're talking about, it could even be one of the most, on the surface, one of the most driest, boring topics, or you might think it's dry, boring, but it started somewhere. And so tap into that. And it could be, their parents were right into it, or they could have had a really great teacher that taught them something about this and it stayed with them forever. So be prepared to share those stories, because they show your passion and credibility. But I think ultimately we think, oh, no one would be interested, or I want to make it sound bigger than what it is. But just stick with those little personal stories about why and what you value and what your purpose is.
Gabrielle, can you talk about like share some stories from or some of the lessons learned from working with these major companies? I mean, these Amazon, you've studied at Harvard, you've done like incredible work. Can you just share a little bit about like working for these big companies and what are some things you've learned from those experiences?
What I've learned, and so I will work for all those big major companies, big major banks. What I've learned is, because when you say you work for
Hmm.
Visa or Amazon, I'm actually working with the people in them. And what I've found is that the vast majority, like 99.9% of those leaders in corporates, really want to do a good job, and they really want to lead well, and they really want to communicate well, and they're just human like everyone else, and they need to learn the skill. And what I've been surprised about is very, very senior leaders still experience that I don't have the courage to do this. I'm scared to do this. I have self-doubt about that. And they want to do a really good job. And that has I think that's a good thing, but it has surprised me, and I did learn about that they're all just human. But we look at someone like Amazon or one of the big banks and go, and like some people even go, how could you even work for them? And I was like, well, I'm working with people that are really good people and want to do well.
Yeah.
I know sometimes collectively they get it wrong, but individually they want to do well. They want to do good work.
Yeah. And tell us about, because you're working with us to get interviewed on podcasts, and just talk a little bit about why podcast guesting. What drew you to being a speaker on podcasts?
Yeah, it's well, I've just launched a new book. Well, I launched the new book in March. So for some reason I'm fallen into this almost habit of publishing a new book every 2 years. And every time I write a book, I think I'm not going to write another book, but here I am writing another book. And of course, it was published in March this year. So we were, still in lockdown around the world. My normal, I guess I'd be traveling. So I've done a bit of guest podcasting before, but I've, and probably very much in Australia as well, where all my contacts are. So I just thought maybe as a different way to market this time, because I can't be traveling, is that I travel via podcasts and so I started looking around and thought maybe that's my strategy. I do a lot of guest podcasting.
Yeah.
As a way to sort of build momentum around the book and see where it goes.
Yeah. And I want you to share with everyone, how do you work? So do you just work with these major corporations, or do you have like one-to-one consulting clients as well?
I don't have one-to-one. I'm not.
Okay.
I sort of. It's one of those things where I do it occasionally, but it's what gives me energy, and
Hmm.
I don't know whether it's my ego or I love a standing ovation, but I love working in crowds, so I do
Yeah.
love that. So I have missed going virtual, but virtuals work really well. I'm running a half-day virtual workshop after this. And I was meant to be jumping on a plane to New Zealand next week to run 2 days in New Zealand, because Australia and New Zealand open up a travel bubble. But here in Melbourne, Victoria, we've had a little mini COVID outbreak,
Oh,
and we have just entered, as of midnight last night, a 7-day lockdown. So I
oh.
won't be going anywhere. Um, but but what I do, so I work
Hmm.
with these sort of major companies, but I run public programs. So
Okay.
that allows individuals. So I run public storytelling workshops, I run public presenting with impact workshops. And I guess it's one of the reasons I sort of wrote the books too, is because anyone can access that. So I've written 6 books. I should mention one of the little books I've written it, and I say it's a little book because it's very small, was storytelling for job interviews, and I actually give that away for free. So anyone can access from my website. So just the fact that you were talking about, you did spoke with how to do job interviews. There's a storytelling for job interviews book that you can just download the PDF from my website for free. So yeah, I mainly do workshops, keynotes,
Mhm.
and I touch individuals through my public programs.
That's awesome. Yeah, because I know that a lot of our listeners, as podcast guests, want to hone their storytelling skills. So I wanted to make sure everyone knew how they could get more support from you. So it sounds like your books and your workshops are perfect.
Yeah, I would say if you want to start somewhere, I think probably my latest book, Magnetic Stories: Connect with Customers and Engage Employees, is probably the best place to start,
Perfect.
considering we're monetizing the mic. I think it's probably
Yes.
the best place. And on my website, you can access a 7-day storytelling starter kit, and that's free. So if you just go to my website, you'll see it there, and you'll get an email from me with a little video for once a day for a week, and it'll get you started.
Cool.
Hence why it's called the starter kit.
Amazing. That's perfect. So your website, gabrielledolan.com. Is there anywhere else you want to direct, or is that the place that people can go to get in touch with you and get your books and all that good stuff?
Oh, look, that's the place to go. And of course, I'm on LinkedIn, so LinkedIn's a good way to connect as well.
Awesome. So go check out GabrielleDolan.com, Get Magnetic Stories. That sounds like a perfect book for this audience. And thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Jess. Really enjoyed it.